a policy podcast where big ideas meet real action. Presented to you by Kautilya Society, NALSAR Public Policy Group. At Not Why But How, we believe that good ideas are just the beginning. What matters is making them work. No ivory towers, no endless debate, just sharp and practical conversations on turning policy into action. My name is Jigyasa.
And I am Devika, and we are delighted to host for the inaugural edition of Not Why But How, an individual who wears many hats with remarkable finesse. A distinguished lawyer, an accomplished author, and one of India's most seasoned politicians. Our guest is none other than Mr. Salman Khurshid. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Khurshid is a former External Affairs Minister, Law Minister, and currently a senior advocate in the Supreme Court of India. Not only is he known for his political acumen, but his eloquence and insight into the legal and social issues that plague us today have made him a respected voice in policy circles. Mr. Khurshid, as students like Jigyasa and myself, we strive to understand how foreign policy is shaped by popular media and the narratives that surround it. However, it seems that over the tenures of the current External Affairs Minister as well as the former External Affairs Minister, there is a certain glamorized media image of how foreign policy works and how it is implemented in India in relation to, let's say, international organizations or even, friendly ally countries. So, as young citizens and as aspiring policymakers, our question to you is, how do we critically look at foreign policy that India has in a way that is not colored by these biases that the media sort of tries to implement upon us?
That's interesting. Does one do an analysis of what is happening with media or an analysis with what is happening with politics or indeed the two together in context of what is happening with foreign policy? I think a great deal is happening on all three fronts. Foreign policy, as we traditionally understand foreign policy in this country, had a lot to do with the aspirations that we had in terms of our seeking independence, the path that we were shown by the likes of Mahatma Gandhi, and then his very, very close followers, the first Prime Minister and a series of other people who were both prime ministers and foreign ministers in this country, had an element that I would say was a value element or element of ethics, that international relations was not to be different from domestic politics, and both were supposed to be moored in some ethical thinking about the world. So what you thought about the world from within, right. You thought about the world from without, etc. And that possibly led to many, many decisions that we took in foreign policy that today are being questioned for being decisions that were not beneficial for India or not in the interest of India, etc. And I don't want to go into that saga of those decisions that are questioned all the time. Just sum it up by saying that what is quite often questioned today is the very vision of Jawaharlal Nehru, who was critical to foreign policy after our independence. So foreign policy, which is based in values and ethics, at best an enlightened self-interest, you might call, is today to be judged by standards that are very different. And I think the standards that are transforming standards that we see today in the world, in many ways, are being personified by the latest pronouncements of the United States of America. Now I often wonder when everybody says in the United States of America, because they voted for such a government, making America great again and putting America first before anybody else. Now, if we just say the same thing, making India great again and putting India first, etc., it sounds wonderful. Sounds wonderful at home. But what does it do to the world as a whole? And we've seen the headlines in the newspapers today what happens when you have MAGA and Maggie or whatever. Where do you go? Where do you go is a breakdown of a system that's developed out of a sense of a balance of pragmatic politics and principled politics. The principles that give you a rule-based system of world governance is the part of foreign policy, and promoting it, keeping in mind the fundamental values of Indian ethos would be what our foreign policy was. But it's changing today. It's becoming transactional. It's becoming foreign policy with one-upmanship, with dominance, etc. Now, we cannot and must not dominate like the great powers dominated at one point in time. The great powers like Britain, great powers like other European great powers, and the United States of America. The whole things like regime change and imposing your views of the world on other people. We were never part of it, right. Which is why essentially we gave birth to, along with Yugoslavia and Egypt, we gave birth to non-aligned movement.
Right.
Now, today everyone thinks non-aligned movement was a mistake. Was silly, right. That you should have aligned. And the present foreign minister very clearly says that we made a mistake by not choosing to be aligned. May not use the same words,
right.
But now he's somebody who's a product of the non-aligned movement, and a good product, and a brilliant product of the non-aligned movement. But today, circumstances on the ground have made him change his position.
Right.
Now, whether this position is a substantive change or it is just a change of appearances, etc., right. Time will tell.
I think, sir, it's quite brilliant that you did bring up this change in the way the global world looks at foreign policy and their own policy. And we are quite interested to look at how domestic policy is affected. I think it's a great example is being brought by this rise of right-wing populism across the world, be it not just United States, I feel France as well, in Germany. And in such a scenario, how does then domestic policy be affected when foreign policy is so dramatically changing from the way we had looked at in the Nehru era, and when we looked at pragmatic or another way of looking at foreign policy in such a changing global dynamics? What should be the trajectory that India should look at in terms of navigating their domestic policy with in relation to their foreign policy and the world's foreign policy?
Well, see, this is the really the tough area now.
Right.
It's a tough area for the simple reason that you have to see the relationship of foreign policy with domestic policy.
Right.
Is it to use the phrase dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog?
Exactly.
Right. Now, because we had a particular Gandhian perception and Nehruvian perception of domestic policy, it sort of easily combined with what we were doing in the world, right? And that's where I mentioned NAM and so on.
Right.
Now it's different because your policy at home is dramatically changed.
Right.
Dramatically changed for a variety of reasons. Dramatically changed. There was, and I have to be candid here, there was a change in economic policy where we talked about reform. And we moved away from state control to a more of a free market, but not completely a free market, etc. Because we provided a very strong social welfare basket, right, and a social welfare net to protect people who, in a freer market, let's say, were not going to be able to stand on their own feet because of historical circumstances. So that change happened, and that change presumably continues. But that change that continues for us was very clearly a change that was not to go into oligarchies or to monopolies. We kept the law alive, the law of competition, the law of monopolies, etc., seen now in the version of the law on competition.
Right.
So we kept all that alive. We kept the social welfare basket alive. We added enormous amounts of schemes for such as the right to education,
Right.
the right to food,
Food.
right? These are schemes in which you brought people up to a level who otherwise might have found that they were disadvantaged. Now, but an overall change of the domestic policy, particularly
Right.
as far as majoritarian emphasis is concerned, I wouldn't put it further than that, but just a majoritarian emphasis is concerned, is something that must play itself out in the world as well.
Right.
But there are constraints. You try majoritarianism in the Arab world, and you're told where to get off, right? So you're very careful. You're careful. You don't push it there. You don't push it there, but you push it elsewhere. You push it surprisingly. I mean, I thought it was surprising the last 4 or 5, 6 years in the United States of America, and I thought, how can someone who is a minority in the United States of America, migrant minority, be supportive of a majoritarian view? But frankly, the answer was given by the presidential election this time. So I don't know what to say about that. But clearly, there is now a mix of what to do with international policy, international relations, where our domestic policy is changing so dramatically. Just one interesting question for people of your background is, what are we going to do, India going to do? We've taken inspiration from the United States Constitution and its constitutional processes about diversity, about inclusion, about equity, about DEI. Now today we are told DEI is dead.
Yes.
Right? DEI is dead. So what are we going to do with the? Fortunately, in the United States, it was based largely on formulated policy, right, within the four corners of the Constitution. In India, the Constitution specifies DEI.
Correct.
So to do away with DEI, you have to change the Constitution, and you need 2/3 majority, and the basic structure comes in, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
So I think these are all matters in the pipeline, and to take a firm view on this would be difficult. But clearly, foreign policy will have to be restructured, redesigned, reworked, etc., to see how it coincides with we first for every country. And if we all become we first, then the world order will break down. If we go to the United States, if we go to the United Nations at the General Assembly, and we all stand up and say, we first, we first, we first, what is left of the General Assembly? So I think there are very, very serious challenges that we'll have to face in the months and years to come.
I'm very glad, sir, that you brought up the social welfare basket and how a government deals with its vulnerable populations when you're also trying to introduce a free market economy. Since the global economic world is also changing and India is a part of the WTO, we have intersecting or conflicting interests in policy making about who to target and how to do that in the best, most efficient possible way. For example, the MSP debate is seen as, or at least to us was seen as, a purely domestic issue about a negotiation between the farmers and the government. And so here, when we are told that the WTO has a role to play and foreign policy and how India intersects with international organizations has a role to play, how does India then navigate this sort of fine balance situation between these issues?
See, this is not just in the WTO, not just
Right.
on matters of trade. This is also true in climate change.
Absolutely, the
Right?
balance. Yes.
So there is seemingly a contradiction or inherent conflict between what you believe you deserve as a country, as a people, and what the world is requiring you to do. And there, of course, therefore, exemptions and exceptions become very important now for people in India to be able to say that, look, you have taken the liberty to toy with the climate and advanced, and now you're telling us not to touch the climate at all while we remain backward. So basically what you need to do is you need to compensate, and you need to help us, which is what you do with the poor or with the disadvantaged or with the vulnerable in your own country, is to say that we are all wedded to equality. But no equality will happen if there isn't a substantive equality, and therefore the Indian Constitution provides special protection and special concessions for people, women, and the other vulnerable communities, etc. Now, this is the basis, the philosophical basis in which you have to speak to the world and say, we are doing this, and this is not something that is not accepted, it is accepted. We are doing this not to influence the world market, but we are doing this to protect our own vulnerable farmers. Because terms of trade in India are not sufficiently directed towards agriculture for a variety of historical circumstances. Until that happens, we need to protect them. Now, is this protection that is excessive? Is this protection that is rational, which is reasonable and objective? It's something that we can talk about and debate. And then whatever we are required to do, we can try and explain to our own population as well. That's how we'll have to move forward. But see, one way in which we try to reverse the terms of trade, or reverse meaning give it a direction towards agriculture, was in the historic Land Acquisition Amendment Act that we brought.
Yes.
2013, I think
Correct.
it was, right? The idea was that, one, you're taking away something with which the farmer is attached in many ways.
Correct.
Not simply for earning a living, etc.
Right.
But if he's losing that, in any case, he must ensure that for 2 generations or 3 generations, we've given him protection that everybody else who is better off and who's in industry or who is in commerce is able to get. And therefore, we introduced those 4 times and 2 times the compensation plus approval by a majority of people, plus giving them facilities like hospitals, schools and colleges in that area, and whichever other way we could compensate, solatium and so on. Now that the present government has reversed considerably, it's
Right.
reversed, and reversed at the level of the Supreme Court.
Correct.
So that is a worrisome thing. So that was one way of telling the farmer that we're doing something for you. So it
Right.
isn't just about how much you get for your wheat and how much you get for your rice,
Right.
but it was more than how much do you get and how much more you can get, etc. But that seems to have been thrown off tracks, etc.
True.
So let's see what happens in future.
Precisely, sir. So on the issue of subsidies, because since we touched upon it right now in this conversation, isn't it inherently contradictory, since the US government has a certain amount of incentives that it offers to farmers in their own country, and the WTO on the other hand, or institutions that are heavily influenced by the West, generally tend to have this sort of inclination towards the West, and then how does their policy being sort of in this along the same direction that, let's say, a welfare state like India would potentially want to go in, how does this contradiction sort of manifest in the pressures that are put upon countries like India, developing countries, that want to follow along the same footsteps but are then held back by the argument of free market?
Well, see, look, India was not alone in this.
No.
And
Absolutely.
so when India negotiated or negotiates on anything, there is the vast stretches of Africa and Latin America that stands by India. So for us to think that, oh, we are unique and therefore we are being treated unfairly is wrong, because you have a voice that is representative of voice of a large number of countries. In many ways, even the richer countries have some common concerns as we have, and I'm talking about the Arab countries there. But many African countries have concerns which are greater and deeper than ours.
Correct.
And they may have those concerns vis-a-vis us also, but largely we are able to represent them. But the peculiarity of this thing is that if you look at the United Kingdom, for instance, the United Kingdom, they preserve some of their landscape by giving farmers money not to till the ground, so that the pastures remain as they are, on which all you have is sheep grazing,
Right.
and that is important for their tourism. So they give money. They give money for not growing anything. Europe gives money or is demanded money for milk produce, or for tomatoes, or for eggs, etc. Now you know how serious that becomes with farmers getting into conflict with governments there.
Right.
So this problem and contradictions will arise everywhere, but we have to learn to dialogue, learn to work, find formula, and find ways in which you can have a win-win on both sides. And that can only be done if you negotiate the right rules for the world. So a rule-based governance is inevitable. So it might be that the whole system breaks down, and then you start making the rules again. So it happened with the Second World War, the First World War, the Second World War. We tried to put together a system. It broke down. Another war came, and so the League of Nations couldn't prevent another war coming. And then after the Second World War, you had the United Nations. Now, United Nations was supposed to prevent all possible future wars.
Yeah.
But we all know how many wars they were able to prevent.
Right.
Now, America says, I will prevent wars. Now, let's see what America can do. But the answer lies in looking ultimately at a rule-based system. And the rule-based system has to be first begun with a dialogue, which is a dialogue of equals, and where concessions have to be made to somebody who apparently is not at the table, to make sure that they actually get to the table and are able to say what they want to say.
Sir, I'm so glad that you brought about a rule-based system where everybody at least in some opportunity are taken as equal, so that a better bargain or a better way of navigating internal interests can be met for countries which have probably graver situations, African countries for that matter. But sir, I want to know, when the international pedestals or places where we conduct dialogue, for example, be it United Nations, World Trade Organization, when they were built on these ideas of inherent structural biases, like for example, WHO being funded primarily, initially at least, by the United States, or this inherent biases that exist in the interest of the Western worlds. In a situation such as this, when the countries inherently are not at an equal pedestal, and the international forums that are built are done so to favor the West, in that scenario, how does a country, even India or some another country, negotiate for a better bargain, at the same time try to protect their own national interests?
Well, clearly, this is a fundamental democratic principle. The voice of the numbers matters. So if the numbers are vulnerable, then they can come together,
Right.
and they can come together and demand. And to say that it doesn't really matter because the powerful will always have their own way, may be true up to a point that the powerful, in matters of contract, for instance, you would be aware that if there is unequal bargaining power,
Right.
then you call those contracts being unconscionable.
Correct.
And unconscionable contracts can be voided, and so
Right.
on and so forth. Similarly, rules about this can ensure that there is greater parity, there is greater equality, and there is greater participation than is normally possible if you're just talking about somebody very powerful and somebody weak. And it can't be that every country has everything it needs. There are things that every country needs. If nothing else, they need markets. And that's a very strong bargaining thing,
Right.
that you need markets.
Right.
There is much to be learned from the Chinese.
Right.
There is much that we can contribute, and there's much to be learned from Europe. But ultimately, it'll be the best minds that have to sit down and work on what brings pressure, what avoids pressure, what brings systematic change so that the rules will prevail, etc. And for this international negotiations, you need the best minds and
Right.
people who have the experience to be able to do this. And ultimately, in a democracy, what really matters is the numbers. So if you have the numbers with you,
Right.
on whatever persuasion, if you have the numbers with you, you'll be fine. And I think we have done well thus far in the international world because we've had numbers on our side.
So I think I want to have a follow-up to that. I feel the numbers, while being extremely true, in the international realm, I feel I may stand to be corrected here, but when a lot of stake was involved, perhaps in the early 2000s, when while the United States was looking to build NATO, they had interests, or they had a lot of need for the Western world to cater, to expand their business, to globalize, to a set of multinational corporations. Do you still feel that? But nowadays, as with the Trump government, and so the inward angle that Western countries have taken for themselves, is that still, will that, in that kind of a scenario when they don't see the outside world as much more important perhaps, then do we still have that bargaining power with us to get a better deal?
Well, I think you have to take yourself away a little bit and then look at the larger picture.
Okay.
What was India's attitude to Brexit, for instance?
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
A lot of people thought, well, this is a great thing because it allows Indians to dominate. It allows India to negotiate directly with UK, and we'll have a free trade agreement with UK, etc., which never happened.
Right.
Which never happened. But Europe had come together in the European Union in the hope that they would fortify themselves with against the whole world,
Right.
but particularly against the US.
Yes.
Right? So
Right.
they'd come across. And therefore, US must also have celebrated that England has broken away in Brexit. But is US happy today? I'm not sure that it's happy with the UK.
True.
UK is still has an element that is saying that we made a mistake, and look at what we have suffered because we moved out. They made some inroads into ensuring that some migrants were allowed and some people allowed to come and work from Europe because they needed the cheap labor.
Right,
That
right.
labor is still coming.
Right.
So these are things that you cannot sort of hope that only one particular dimension is all you need, because there are so many dimensions that you take into account. Now today, what kind of trade war will emerge between Europe and the US, between US and Canada, US
Right.
and Mexico? Of course, there are other factors. There are factors about illegal immigration and so on. But it's not just illegal immigration. It's more than that. It's about rules and of tariffs and trade deficits, etc. We have a trade deficit with China, and we have a terrible trade deficit with China. But if we decide to place huge tariffs on Chinese goods coming to India, will that necessarily be a good thing? I don't know whether it'll be necessarily a good thing.
Yes.
So all this will have to be considered somewhat soberly and seriously. The trouble is, popular politics comes in the way, because popular politics for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, for 6 months, for a year gives you a sense of elation and success.
Absolutely.
And
So
approval. But what happens at the end of the day? Now, you were just talking about subsidies.
Right.
Now, there's no subsidies in India.
Correct.
There are freebies in India, right? And the Supreme Court has to remark about the freebies in India. But try telling that to any political leader that freebies are a bad thing, and you'll have your answer. So there we have a problem. We have a problem of how to cut down financial deficit.
yes.
How to balance our budgets, etc. And yet we have a clear idea that freebies is what makes you win elections, etc. So it's one's freebie against another freebie. So it's no longer one man's meat is another man's poison. It's actually one man's freebie against another man's freebie. So that's how it goes.
So true. That's essentially what I was just about to ask you, sir, and I think you've succinctly answered it as well. That so there's this idea that welfare policies are populism. They're for electoral politics, and that is the end to which that they are sort of targeted. So since coming from the political angle that you, let's say, inhabit, how does one sort of respond to this criticism that that there is a mere populist angle to introducing economic benefits such as the
See, there are economists have worked on this. It isn't as though nobody has worked on it. There are two kinds of subsidies or two kinds of welfare measures. One that ultimately is encouraging greater production or productivity.
Right.
Right. So, if you give somebody free education, you're actually ensuring that in times to come you'll have greater productivity and you'll have greater efficiency. So you can't just simply say you're wasting money on education. Similarly, if you give free medical aid, to say that this is just a waste, why don't you let them die, etc., is a terrible thought. It's a terrible idea, because people with better health and a country with better health is going to be better off, because again productivity will go up, and if not productivity, your cost of maintenance will come down. So you have to do an analysis of what being permitted is going to deal and consist of measure of productivity, or what will just be pleasing someone and saying take this, etc. Now the Supreme Court made a comment the other day saying that you want to turn people into parasites. Now that's only one part of the thing. You are a parasite if you're not getting something that will induce productivity, etc. Then you're being a parasite and you're actually becoming a drain. But if you work out these freebies in a proper manner, even housing, for instance, giving housing is ultimately going to help to have a happier society, more productive society, and more creative society. So you can't say that housing is bad. You can't say that giving free toilets is bad. You can't say that giving free food is bad. But who are you giving free food to is very important. So the analysis has to be devoid of immediate politics. It has to be a clear combination of economics and politics.
I think, sir, that is such well put. I feel the pragmatic argument for freebies has been lost to political discourse, and which I think was perhaps the initial ideas with introducing welfare. And I think the very idea to keep India's economy closed was that businesses do not get foreign parties come into picture so that they have a fighting chance. So, sir, why do you think that pragmatism in understanding welfare has been lost? And I feel like that has been lost in the international world as well, not just in India. Where did we?
Yeah, well, I can't say about the international world because I'm not sort of very clear about what is the level of thinking that you have.
True. And it's not uniform everywhere.
Various societies are not uniform everywhere. But in India, certainly, this is not the only area of public discourse that has suffered. There is public discourse that has suffered on many things. Now, I mean, I give you an extreme example. For instance, periodically you have people. There are two kinds of people who are against animal slaughter. There are animal welfare people, understandable, because they have a thesis and they have a theory and they have a philosophy that they support. That is quite understandable. But there are people who do it for other reasons, and I don't want to go into what the other reasons are, but those are very narrow sort of reasons. Now, people who are against animal slaughter for narrow reasons within the country don't ever sort of concede that they and their community in Nepal and even in certain parts of India do sacrifice animals. Now, animal slaughter for sacrifice is permissible, but animal slaughter for feeding yourself is not permissible. That's completely an irrational argument. But obviously somebody has lost track of the rationality and objectivity of this to say, well, all I'm saying is don't do it in front of me. I get a bit upset. Do it somewhere else, right? Don't do it in front of me. Which is, I think that's the kind of allowance, that's the kind of accommodation that anybody should make. But when you have a very strident animal movement, animal welfare person, then it's difficult, because then how do you accommodate that person? Either you turn completely vegetarian, or find some other way of mollifying them and accommodating them. But that's the whole idea of managing plural societies is where people with different points of view will live together because they have some area of commonality that allows them to come together as a society. But within that, whatever the divergences are, how do you address those, and how do you reduce them, if not eliminate them, is the big challenge for plural societies.
I think that was very well said. I feel like even in small spaces such as NALSAR, the discourse at times can get very narrow when increasingly we as a country or the world are becoming so pluralist in nature. And I think, sir,
the idea is
Yes.
places like NALSAR and
Yes.
places like the universities
Yes.
will keep the discourse alive and
Yes, sir.
and to keep it worthy
Yes.
of our democracy, even if it's breaking down elsewhere. But these are the places from where it will emanate again to get people back on track. But it's important that you keep it alive here, and I'm quite sure that you do.
Thank you. I
Yes,
think,
sir. Hopefully,
and definitely, sir. And with that brings us to the end. Mr. Khurshid, thank you so much for your insights and helping us think beyond the headlines, I would rather say. As young citizens, our engagement with policy must go beyond just critique. It should be encouraging for better governance, a more rational way of thinking, being more objective with the way we look at the world around us. And thank you everyone for tuning in, for listening to us. And until next time, keep asking, not why, but how.